So I wanted to look outside and see what impact did the women outside of Israel have on Israel. So I started looking at literature and, of course, a lot of information and texts. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about where do we get all this information from. We can now. There's ample in the Bible, in the Old Testament, to stay in the Old Testament, uh, and interpret things through the Old Testament. But what more can we get when we start looking at the literature? Now, I read between 500,000 and 2 million texts from the ancient Near East that have been uncovered. Now, not all of them have been translated, not all of them are available. Many of them are in fragments, so we do get some pieces. Plus, many texts in the ancient Near East are actually duplicates of other texts, so not everything is original, or they're copies over time of the same text. But there is a lot of information that is now available to us. And if you think of 200 years ago, in the last 200 years is really when archaeology became a science, because before that, there was no such thing as the field of archaeology. Even 150 years ago is when it began to develop. And so people started digging in the 16, 1700s, 1800s. People were finding pieces of texts in different places in the ancient Near East, but they didn't know what to do with them because nobody could read Akkadian, nobody could read Sumerian. I mean, there were languages that could be read and understood at that time, but many of the languages have only been deciphered since the mid 1800s, and even more in the 1900s. And several libraries, royal libraries, archives of all kinds have been uncovered throughout the ancient Near East. And so it has created this field of Assyriology. And Assyriology, that field covers the study of languages of the ancient Near East, but also text, theology, culture, all kinds of things that we didn't know before. And my work was primarily in the Northwest Semitic languages, although I had to study some of the East Semitic languages of Mesopotamia. But the Northwest Semitic languages, meaning Hebrew, Moabite, Edomite, Ammonite, Ugaritic, Phoenician, and the dialects related to the West. And I remember thinking while I was writing my dissertation, there better not be an archaeologist who discovers another Northwest Semitic. I'm going to wring his or her neck. Because I was working with the verbal system and really reading text and doing a lot of analysis. So, but also it's nice to work with the linguistic piece, but the language gives you information, a lot of information of all kinds. So archaeological discoveries that impact our understanding of not just women, but the biblical world is throughout the ancient Near East. You come from Mesopotamia here and Sumer, Mesopotamia, all the way into Egypt. So this is the Levant, the greater world where major sites with major bundles of texts or discoveries of texts at Nineveh and at Uruk and at Ur, which we don't have here. Susa, you think of the story of Esther, of course, during the Persian Empire. Ugarit, which is one of the languages that has really helped us understand Baal, because there's one of the major texts is the Baal cycle, and also has helped us understand some of the Northwest Semitic languages and linguistic features in Hebrew that we were wondering about in Hebrew, and Ugaritic, when that was discovered in 1928, then ended up being very helpful. Tyre which is now in Lebanon. Of course, that's where the Phoenicians were. So the Phoenician language is one of the languages where we have texts that contributed to our understanding. Now, they come in all shapes, form, script, languages of all kinds. On the top left, you have a small text written in cuneiform language, and it's interesting also that you can see the size. It's very small, fits in somebody's hand. But also you can see that there was an envelope at one point around the text. And sometimes, in order to make sure that the messenger did not change the message on the way to the recipient, they had an envelope that was formed around the tablet. And sometimes the same text was written on the envelope, and sometimes just the seal of the leader who was sending the information was on the envelope. So the recipient would break the envelope and know that they had the original text that was sent to them. Here we have the Siloam inscription. If you think of the story of Hezekiah and Hezekiah's tunnel, anybody here has gone through Hezekiah's tunnel? It's wonderful. One of my favorite things to do in Jerusalem is to walk through the tunnel for about a third of a mile in the water up to your knees sometimes, ankles sometimes a little higher depending how tall you are. And at the end, at one point, when they started cleaning up the tunnel, they discovered the inscription that explained how they had actually dug the tunnel. We have a little bit of information in Chronicles about the digging of the tunnel, but this inscription was very helpful. So this is the Paleo-Hebrew script, and this is the script that was used in pre-exilic Hebrew. Before the Israelites went into exile, this was the common text. So a lot of the Hebrew texts, Phoenician texts that we have from before the exile are written in this script. Now, why is there a change after the exile? It's because Aramaic became the lingua franca of the ancient Near East. Therefore, the Aramaic script, which we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is still the same alphabet, but changed a bit. So this is part of Dead Sea Scroll, which is, of course, a recent discovery, if you think of the mid-1940s, and a very interesting story about where, when, how, and right at the time when Israel was being declared as a state. So there was political tension, of course, in the entire region. And so they ended up finding a lot of the texts, and not just biblical texts. There are a lot of texts that are extra biblical commentaries, the documents on how the Essenes lived in Qumran. The only biblical portion, Old Testament, that they did not find is the book of Esther. So when I go to Israel, when I go to Qumran, I always try to find a hole that I can scratch to see maybe I could find the scroll of Esther. And that would take care of my retirement. And but so far, nothing. Now this one is the Moabite stone that was found in Dibon. And it talks about an encounter that the Israelites had with the Moabites. So it does mention the same king, the king of Israel also. At that time it was discovered, eventually broken into pieces, and they did some reconstructions, but this is also available. Now, if you read Hebrew, I tell my students, if in Hebrew exegesis, if you can read Hebrew, you can read Moabite, because Moabite is the closest, linguistically speaking, to Hebrew. You know, Phoenician is close, but not as close as Moabite. Edomite, Ammonite also are quite close to Hebrew, but there are some differences that are a little bit further out from Moabite. However, the corpus of Edomite and Ammonite is so small that you can become an Ammonitist in one day or Edomitist in one day. Of course, you never just do Edomite or Ammonite. You do this within the study of other Semitic languages. All right, so here are some of the discoveries. of major texts. There are almost 400 texts that were discovered in Egypt, written in cuneiform on small tablets. This was correspondence between Canaan, primarily between Canaan, some from Jerusalem, some from the coast, with the leader in Egypt, because the area, Canaan, was under Egypt at that time. So these were discarded. They were found in 1887. Very interesting types of things that you find are help, help, the enemy's around the corner, send up reinforcement. But very formulaic also, because a lot of them begin with, at your feet 7 times I bow. And it's like, hello, greetings, dear so-and-so. So that's how you started a text. And then you stated your case. And then you have, most of them are not signed, so we don't know who wrote them, which makes it very interesting when we start talking about ancient Near Eastern texts. Who wrote them? Very few have names on them. And so we have a tendency to go towards it must be male authorship. Well, especially in the first millennium in Canaan, I suspect that there's a lot more literacy among women than what we have thought about. Now, we don't have a lot of evidence because people didn't sign the text. Now, in Egypt, around 500 BC, we have a wonderful text in Aramaic that mentioned a lot of women who purchased property, Jewish women, not Egyptian women, Jewish women from a Jewish group that had left Canaan in order to go into Egypt when the Assyrians came, when the Babylonians came. And so they were able to establish a Jewish community in Egypt called Elephantini, or Yev in some of the literature. And what we find there is that you actually have names of women and signatures of women, contracts of women purchasing property, women and marriage contracts and these types of things. So these are Jewish women who came from Canaan, from Israel, and ended up in Egypt. So we don't have that type of signed document in Canaan itself. Ugaritic texts, so these are the ones I mentioned earlier, showed the town, very important text, 1948 and 1928. And Ugarit only existed from around 1400 to 1200. We know that around 1200 BC, the Hittite Empire fell, and there was a whole movement of people in the biblical world, whole movements of people that shifted from one area to the other and conquered areas. Therefore, Ugarit was destroyed at that time, and their literature ended up being buried until 1928 when they discovered the town. And why do I call these archaeological accidents? Because several times at Amarna, Ugarit, you had somebody who was plowing the field, and then ended up with Kaklonk. Oh, I wonder what that is. Oh, darn, a city. And and then when they start digging, archaeologists come in, of course, and it's mostly at Ugarit, the French archaeologists from France who came and excavated. So a lot of the literature after 1928, when they started deciphering the language and translating the text, was first done in French. And then after that, translated in English. Scholars ended up there also. Of course, Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a whole field, whole area of study. Nuzi tablets, which is interesting. Nuzi is an ancient town that existed on the Euphrates River, Tigris-Euphrates area, that provides for us information on how the patriarchs lived. Because sometimes we read the patriarchal narratives and we think, gee, how odd, that you would have the wife who's your sister or sister wife, or that you introduce yourself as your sister when it's convenient, or as the wife when it's a different situation. So that's one type of thing where the culture that is described in the patriarchal narratives in the Hebrew Bible is very much described also in the Nuzi tablets of northern Syria. 1400 were discovered, but covers the culture that also came before that. So this opened up a world of understanding of what was going on in the patriarchs' lives. And also other libraries were found at Nineveh, Mari, Ebla, Babylon. And tomorrow I'll talk about prophetesses. And so I'll talk a little bit about the traditions of prophets, prophetesses, also in ancient Near Eastern literature, because prophetesses did not just exist. And we heard that from Nijay Gupta this morning, that prophecy, what is prophecy? And how did that work in the ancient world? So what were the materials on which all these things were written? Stone, clay, metal, wooden tablets, papyrus, leather. Of course, these are much more prone to disintegrate, while stone, clay, and metal, a lot of texts have been found in these materials, because even though if they're buried, they can stay intact. There's a very interesting text in Sumerian from the 3rd millennium BCE that scholars have called a school text. And it's the story about this scribe who talks about his training in school in Sumer, where as you can see, the language is quite complicated. And this is very early text, and has about, how many letters do we have in our alphabet? 20 something, 22 in Hebrew, Phoenician. Well, you had about 2,000 signs. The most common were about 600 signs were the most common. So to become literate and become a scribe was really a lifetime of training before you could get to that point where you could function as a scribe. So this tablet, this text that was found, called the school text, it talks about how this little guy would pack his mother would pack his lunch, which is interesting, because most of the texts that we have in the ancient Near East, especially in Akkadian, are not personal texts, are not like we journal. Why? Because it's easy for us to write, and we're all literate. But if you have a very, very complex language, first of all, only the elites could afford to have a scribe. And so that's why we have a lot of royal libraries that have been uncovered, a lot of official documentation, trade types, contract type stuff. But when you find a text that talks about emotions, it's very precious. Or talks about your mom and your dad, that's very precious. And so in this school text, we actually have that. He talks about how his mom would pack his lunch and he would go to school, and he would, one of his teachers would form his tablet, and the other teacher would help him learn the signs, and then they would go to recess, and he would speak in the language he wasn't supposed to speak, so they caned him. And so then he would say, then I would go in classroom and I made a ruckus, so they caned me. And then I would not learn properly, do my homework, and then they would cane me. So you can see this poor little guy, constantly being disciplined in a physical way, in a way that was not pleasant. And so he goes home and he says, I'm not going back. I'm not going back to school. I can't stand this. I'm not being treated well. And but his father ends up inviting the teacher over, teacher-parent meetings in the home. And the father bribes the teacher, and the teacher takes him back because the teacher didn't want to take him back. And if you lost your place in the scribal school, it was to your detriment, because if you became a scribe, and we have that in Egyptian texts also, if you became a scribe, you were ensured prosperity and a job for life. because there were so few scribes who were trained at that level to be hired by the palace or be hired in legal matters and that type of thing. So anyways, this little guy went back to school. I don't know how many more times he was caned, but he wrote the text. So that means that he actually graduated. So he made it through the program and left us with this amazing, wonderful little text, but preserved in a clay tablet. And a lot. So when you think of the ancient Near East, we only know what we have. There's a lot more that is still hidden under the surface, all over the place, or a lot of material that has not been excavated, or a lot of material that is disintegrated. So there's a lot more information out there that we have not yet had access to. But we have a lot, and we're working with what we have. Here's a picture of when they discovered the library at Ugarit. Then all of a sudden, in archaeology, this is worth, you can't put a number on it, because all of a sudden, each tablet is giving you information, may talk about places, may talk about events, may talk about men, women, mythology, gods, goddesses, all of these things. So you find this, you very carefully excavate and extract it from the ground. And then scholars begin to, first of all, you do the cleanup, all this, but you have to do it so carefully so as not to lose a letter, and because you may change the meaning of the word. So here you have also the seal that was used by the leader who sent the message. So the envelope has the seal, the text is on the tablet itself. As you can see here, the envelope is open, but on this one, you actually have the text. So this is a different envelope. So sometimes you had the text, sometimes you had a seal, but this prevented fraud or changing the text. And you can see all kinds of sizes, very small, sometimes just a little bill of sale, okay? So here, 3 sheep. Here it is. And so you have the proof, you have the invoice. So, so one of the things that you have on tablets are invoices. You have old text. You've all heard about the Gilgamesh epic and the Enuma Elish and the parallel text and the Code of Hammurabi. They all look like they're written in cuneiform, in this kind of script. And there are whole studies of the Mosaic law and the law codes of the ancient Near East, Lipit Ishtar in Sumerian, Hittite law code, Neo-Assyrian law code. A lot of the law codes have been used to try to understand what the Mosaic law really meant, because they lived in similar cultures. Agrarian cultures talk about agrarian stuff. I don't know about you, but I've never moved the boundary stone of my neighbor. And, what's a boundary stone? Well, today for us, it's a fence, but all of a sudden you see, and what was discovered as people looked at the laws, the law codes, is that you have sometimes word for word the same law. Now, we know that the law code of Hammurabi came long before the Mosaic law, centuries before the Mosaic law. So whoever first wrote down the Mosaic law, or how this happened, of course, we call it the Mosaic law, but sometimes I wonder, what are we talking about? You have the law in Exodus, you have laws in Numbers, you have laws in Deuteronomy, you have laws in Leviticus. So what are we talking about? And so when were those things written? Did whosoever write that know the Code of Hammurabi? And one thing a legal code did in the ancient Near East, it wasn't just to keep the community in order, but it was also to establish you as a people among the nations. So the Mosaic law did more than just gives laws on do's and don'ts. It was also, Israel has its own law code. And so it is recognized as a nation among the nation. So here we see very small text. Here we see a large text, the whole side of a mountain in 3 languages, Elamite, Old Persian, and Akkadian, I believe, a dialect of Akkadian. And so this was written, it's massive. And in order for them to be able to read the Behistun inscription, it was in the 1800s that it was actually a diplomat from England, I believe, who was working in that area. This is in Iran of today, and so had to build these scaffolds in order to be able to go and copy or make squeezes of the text that was there. Now, Old Persian was known, or Elamite was known, but not all 3 languages were known. And so what happened is they ended up being informed on a lot of vocabulary in the next language simply because they're the same text in 3 languages. So this helped a lot with the decipherment of ancient languages. So what about the Old Testament? What do we find in all these texts about women? You know, women. Women back then were just like you and me. Sometimes we think of the ancient world or the biblical world, we see people as little stick figures or flannel graph. Anybody remember good old flannel graph? Flat, no emotion, a little bit furry on the side, you know. And but when I think, I have to stop and think about, how do I feel? What frustrates me? Do I feel valued, unvalued? Am I depressed? Is it the time of the month? Or, you know, these women went through exactly the same thing we all go through today. So when we look at biblical women or women in the ancient Near East, we find single, married women. Single was not very well regarded upon. And to be married was really the norm or what you aimed for. Local foreign women, they didn't all live the same way, didn't all have the same culture, didn't all speak the same language, but sometimes with movements of people, you end up interacting. So you have frictions that take place. Barren women, fruitful women. We have texts that deal with all these issues, emotional issues, depression, unloved, rejected, abused women, raped women. And so what you find is that you have some laws that were actually written in law codes about what happens to a woman who's abused, a woman who's raped. And most of the time, the laws are written to protect women from abuse. So if women were lied or accused, falsely accused, that type of thing, so laws were written in a way that if the false accusation was discovered, whoever did the accusation ended up being punished. So sometimes we think, well, women were property of men. Not really. Women were not the property. We don't read it that way. Women were very productive and very involved in society. They had all kinds of wonderful issues, family issues. You know, one day it dawned on me when I was reading the Old Testament and the dysfunctional families, and I thought, wow, my family is a biblical family. You know, when I thought about, oh yeah, when we were young, this, that, did my parents, blah. I mean, I thought, oh, God is so good. And it was a great revelation for me. We read about marital conflicts. We have texts about divorce. We have separation of belongings, who gets the bride price after it was paid, the marriage falls apart, the dowries, who gets that. So a lot of this kind of information is available. Jealousy, sexuality in and outside of marriage, dysfunction of families, violence in families. So texts from the ancient Near East cover a lot of these topics that we see are things in our world today because they're human things. They're human issues. So texts talk to us about uh, women functioning in their private lives at home, wives, mothers, sisters, female servants, concubines, and sometimes the word servant. When I read the Hebrew Bible and I read about servants or slaves, often the same word is translated slaves, many times they were hired workers who could choose to remain there, even marry into the family, and even have their children be adopted by their boss or their owner or that type of thing. So we have to sometimes the way we use terms in modern English today is not necessarily how things function in the ancient world. But you have women prophetesses, queens, judges, mothers of kings, prostitutes, scribes, goddesses. We find all of this in the literature of the ancient Near East. Now, one thing that helps us also learn about women is iconography. And so, what is iconography? It refers to the visual images produced in the ancient Near Eastern world. These artistic materials display a wide variety of subject matter, ranging from simple depictions of human figures, deities, divine symbols, animals, vegetation, to more complex visual portrayals of worship scenes, battles, and tribute processions. The goal of iconography investigation is to describe the content of a given image and to interpret its message and ideas and the way what it was intended to convey at the time. So we talk about texts. I think texts are very important because they give us names, events, all kinds of things that fit in the history of the people. But so does iconography. You look at pictures or statuettes, and what they've uncovered many times are carvings of this, that, or the other. Now this woman, she's awesome. She's not very happy today. She's kind of a little bit on the stiff side right now. But her name is Enheduanna. Enheduanna was a Sumerian priestess, but also a scribe, a female scribe in the 3rd millennium BCE, a female scribe. Very few women went through scribal school, but her father was the king. So she was a privileged woman and she ended up pursuing, but she is the first person to sign her name to a document in cuneiform in the ancient Near East. So the first signed document, earliest signed document, is from Enheduanna. And there's actually a text here that talks about her and her gods and her dedication to her God, etc. So she's left us quite food for thought. Women in 3rd millennium, that's 5,000 years ago, who was literate, who could read, who could write, who could have influence. She composed several psalms, actually, and to the goddess, I forget the name of the goddess that she honored, but she composed, so she's a poet also. So when we talk about art, usually we talk about exegesis of texts. I have a course, Hebrew exegesis. So we read text, we exegete, so we look at the historical context, the intent, the linguistic details, the message, etc., the authorship. But you can do exegesis also of artifacts like this. You can ask yourself all kinds of questions. Historical context, where does it fit? What time period? What type of material was used at that time? Sociological context, you think, is it something that represents good relationship, a nice couple, or is it a lesbian couple? Is it a homosexual couple? Is it representing trade? Is it representing so the whole gamut is there in the ancient Near East. So some of the topics of what we deal with in culture today were well known in the ancient world also. So what do they have to tell us, to inform us? Psychological context, sad, happy, religious context. A lot of the statuettes that were found were also found in temples that had collapsed, or So if you go to some parts of the world today, you'll see a lot of icons. I grew up Catholic, so of course we had crosses with Jesus on it in every room. And until we decided not to. And but anyways, but that was an icon for us. It was tangible. It was there, and you had the beads, and you had all these wonderful things, and they were meaningful at the time. Also, garments and jewelry. And you can, if you find some attached to a family or attached to a person, then you can talk about the status, the social status of the person, wealthy, poor, etc. Here you have this beautiful Queen Puabi, who was a Sumerian queen. And because there's no male name mentioned around her and texts that mention her and the tomb that they found, it's so they think that she could have very well been a queen in her own right in Sumer. Now, there are some parts of the ancient Near East where women could fulfill positions of leadership in politics, for example, much more readily accepted than in other parts of the ancient Near East. So it was not equally the same everywhere. But buried with Queen Puabi, you had this, actually, there are 20 leaves of gold on her headpiece. There were necklaces, earrings, all kinds of jewelry, and two people. Because when you believe that you're going in the afterworld and you're a queen, you need some attendants on the other side. So what I've never known if those were volunteers or or if they had been volunteered or if they were some of her attendants who were completely committed to her and wanted to go to the next world. Because if you believe that you're going in the next world and that you're all going to be together in the next world. The other day I mentioned that, in Islam, those who believe that if they become a martyr for Allah and they die and they go on the other side and have 72 virgins. And I read or heard this little story that one terrorist blew himself up, and when he got to the other side, he found out that there was one 72-year-old virgin instead of 72 of them. But anyway, so people have all kinds of beliefs about the future, the other world. So material culture tells us a lot about social status, about what they did, about progression also. You see on the left, progression of shoes. Oldest versions of the shoes were simply just wrapped, leather wrapped around the feet, but then you get much later, and especially in upper class, you end up with much more sophisticated. Same with garments, developed from a simple loincloth in the 4th, 5th millennium to brightly colored robes and dresses by the Second Temple period. So you have the evolution of clothing, the evolution of shoes, the evolution of jewelry, evolution of all kinds of things in society. Now here is a very interesting little find. It's an ivory spoon that was used for applying cosmetics to the eyes. And sometimes we see illustrations of Egyptian women who have a lot of the black, much more, cosmetics than what you have in the ancient world. But this was found in Assyria. And how would they know? Well, they analyzed what would have been in the hand here. They now have means to analyze how old these things are, what they are, and that type of thing. So that's a beautiful find. Another thing interesting here is a wig. And this wig was made of stone and pretty heavy, but was placed on the statue of women, because many of the festivals carried around or processed with the statues of their gods and goddesses. And so, but there are a lot of wigs in the ancient Near East. Wigs made of hair, wigs made of stone, wigs made of leather, made of jewels, all kinds of things that have been uncovered. This one is doesn't look pleasant. Now, human relationships. I love this. This is one of my favorite icons from the ancient Near East. And when I first saw this, it's from Sumer, which you can see 3rd millennium BCE. I thought it was a big statue. It's not. It actually fits in your hand. And it was discovered in a temple that was destroyed. So I love this. I love, I mean, the deer in the headlight look. It seems a bit overdone, but they usually had stones, precious stones, actually, in the holes that made the eyes, so they made them shine and were beautiful. So I love this couple together in the temple. Were they real people? I don't know. Another couple here, an Egyptian couple, which could it be interracial? It's possible. Others have said because the man worked outside in the sun in Egypt, therefore the skin was darker, more of a reddish color, because several finds like this, you find that one, usually the male, is darker in color than the female. But again, look at the touch. And I like to think about that. They're made of stone. They look cold. However, and they don't smile on things like this, but yet you can see, well fed, and often, I don't know the reason why, but often you'll find that there's one foot in front of the other, usually the left foot, when you look at a lot of these statuettes. So there were traditions that were preserved in art. Now, this is a bed with a couple making love. And if I showed you all that's available, it would be a pornographic session, because there are some that is very, very explicit throughout the ancient Near East. So sexuality was a very important part of life, and fertility was a very important part of life. So having children, especially when you're in an agrarian society, you need a lot of help, a lot of hands, men and women, to make things happen. And so here, this is the bed. So many times the depictions are not on the bed, they're all over the place. And, but anyways, we'll keep going. And families with children, which is very, very nice. Now notice the many times the couples, you see them like this with the arms around each other. Now you would think around each other you want to be a little closer, but that's the way many times they are depicted in showing affection this way. So here's a little girl. Now this is part of the Lachish relief that you have in Canaan. And when the Babylonians or Assyrians had come first, and Babylonian took the people into exile, you can see that women and children are sitting on some of the carts rather than having them walk. Many times you see that the men are shackled together and are walking, but the women and the children, there's a human aspect to this. And if you look at the whole relief, there's actually very difficult things on the relief, because you see people impaled and hanging from poles. And this was one of the Assyrians' horrible, and Babylonians' horrible military warfare tactic. You impale people, you have people beheaded also on that relief. You can see the relief at the British Museum today, but there are great pictures all over the internet, easy to find. When you take the time to look at the details and see, it talks to you about warfare, talks to you about what they did with the people that they conquered, and so a lot of great information there. Now, this is interesting also because you have women breastfeeding. So we have women breastfeeding. The black one is in Egypt, and the other two are Mesopotamia. And one thing that they did in the ancient world is not only use that practice as the mother, but they often hired nurses. And we have stories in the Bible, actually, when we read that a young child who was probably going to lose his life during time of warfare. They wanted to kill the whole family. Well, the nurse and the child were placed together in hiding for a few years, actually. So this is a practice that's very common. You can see the little child here. Another picture I think that I showed earlier, but the lady in the back is braiding the hair of the lady in the front. So again, very common things that we are familiar with, but they did the same there. This is the one that is controversial as far as, is this a lesbian couple or is this a set of twins? But most of the interpreters of the text have talked about lesbianism being part of the culture, especially in Egypt. Actually, Maimonides, who is a medieval Jewish commentator, the Rambam, he did write that lesbianism and homosexuality were features of Egyptian sins type thing, Egyptian aberrations, and as to how they should live life or how they did life. So, in his view, this was nothing different, and this is definitely an Egyptian couple. Well, first of all, is Egyptian text here, and you can see the headdress very clear. And you can see the position of the arms of the two women are the same as the position of the arms that we see on the couple. Now, but what about women at home? We think at home, we come back from work, we sit on the couch, watch TV. There was no such thing in the ancient Near East. The home was busy, everybody was involved. Of course, they had wonderful times together, family times together. But one type of house that all of a sudden appeared all over Canaan around 1200, 1300, 1200 BC, it all of a sudden all popped up all over the place, and it shows us where the Israelites settled, because we know they received their inheritance in the land. And the four-room house has the open space in the middle where a lot was taking place, a lot of the baking and the cooking and the doing all kinds of things and crushing of grain and that type of thing. So this is a typical Israelite four-room house. The household. In ancient agricultural and market-based societies, it was essential for all members of the household to work together to provide for their common life. Everyone capable of working, from the oldest to the youngest, would have responsibilities in the house, field, or family business. So even the little children, they started training them very early to engage in, step on grapes. Oh, this is so fun, and oh, my feet are all red, and whatever. And so to get the little children, get them engaged, get the little boys engaged with their father, and so everyone would have responsibility. And especially in some cases, you would find that more was done than what the household needed. More bread was baked, more beer was made, more grain was thrashed, or whatever you call that. More olive oil was produced. So therefore, some families began bartering system, began selling in marketplaces. And so the household that did well ended up contributing to society outside of their household, not just what they had for themselves. Now, I found this quote in an Assyrian Syrian proverbs. A house without an owner is like a woman without a husband. And I read that and I thought, oh, well, I've never been married. And so I always thought it was interesting when you read in the New Testament, let them ask their husbands at home. Thought, well, I'm in deep kimchi. And because I've never had one. Well, that's for another day. But I remember when I visited the pyramids in Egypt, in Cairo, I took a ride on the camel, and of course you're out there by yourself with this Egyptian who's holding the camel. And all of a sudden you get a proposal. And my father in Canada could have received several camels as a gift. And so it was just inconceivable for them that I would have no husband. I was an adult traveling by myself. And so the culture is like that. And it's like that a lot of places today. I taught in the Philippines several years ago, and I taught a group of pastors in the south in Zamboanga. And it was a 2-week intensive course. The second week, they were more comfortable with me, and they finally said, "Mom, can we ask you a question?" They had been discussing this, how come you're not married? So anyway, I said, well, you have someone in mind, or so anyways, I'm still single. So adoption, we have texts. I have a friend who wrote his doctoral dissertation on adoption in the ancient Near East, texts written in cuneiform that provide information as to who the child was, the family, the reason for the adoption. Was that an orphan, or is it because you need an heir, which we find also in the patriarchal narratives, that you adopt someone because if you don't have an heir, that's one way to get one. You need more hands to do the work, so you adopt children. Or you may purchase a slave, a young slave, and eventually adopt the slave in your family as your child and continue taking care of the child. So we find that in a lot of texts. In the Code of Hammurabi, here are just a few of the laws. There are a lot more laws on adoption. If a man adopts a child and rears him, this grown son cannot be demanded back again. So whatever family was he there because he was sold by his family, he could not. And especially if a craftsman has undertaken to rear a child and teach him his gift, his craft, then he cannot demand him back. If he has not taught him his craft, this adopted son may return to his father's house. So there were many types of situations where a child could be adopted or released from adoption and sent back to his family of origin. And this is around 1800 BC, Law Code of Hammurabi. And so there are a lot more texts on this topic. Women in the economy. In Mesopotamian societies, like in many others, women were probably the main producers of everyday goods. Women's production in households sometimes exceeded the family needs and was then integrated into trade network. Their production was rewarded with silver, but they were not considered professionals. Many women worked within the frame of large institutions and received rations in exchange for their work. When I think about this, and when you read Proverbs 31, 10 to 31, you see how productive the woman was, that she was involved in trade, in business, in her home, and all this. Now, I don't read the text as this is how we should all be. I read the text basically as a obituary. You only say the good stuff. And you say how productive, how nice, how she treated her husband well. I mean, that's more how I read Proverbs 31 than, darn, I'll never make it, And so women were very involved, starting in the home, but also extending beyond the home. Women were very important workers in the household and probably were responsible for many of the skilled tasks in processing farm products, such as spinning, weaving, grinding grain, cooking, as well as bearing and training children. This would have given them considerable authority within the household. So women had power, authority, had a voice. And of course, like today, you have to work together. A healthy household in the ancient Near East was a healthy household that worked well together, men and women, boys and girls, teenagers of both genders. So you see the work being done. They were involved very much in the production of what was needed that everybody wanted to have, bread. But it wasn't just baking the bread. You're out there harvesting in some cases and then crushing the grain and making the flour. And so it's not as easy as just bake. It was a lot of work involved. Same thing with wine making. Olive oil, we see there are a lot of big, beautiful olive presses still there in Canaan, in Israel today. You can go and see them, how they use big, heavy basalt stones to grind, and then they had the oil flow at the bottom. Wonderful things. Harvesting barley. Beer was very common in the ancient Near East. You have actually texts in cuneiform that are beer recipes. And because you had so much barley everywhere. And there's a big conference every year, big conference, the Society of Biblical Literature, where people present academic papers on all kinds of topics related to biblical world, ancient Near East, Egyptology, anything like this. And one year there's a group that decided that they were going to have an ancient Near Eastern beer tasting session based on recipes, beer recipes that they had found written in cuneiform. I don't like beer, so I didn't go, but so I don't know what happened from there. I'm going to have to fly. I have about 30 seconds left. Here's a seal. Archaeologists have discovered seals with women's names, which means that to have a seal meant that you had authority, you had a voice, you had a position, etc. So now one of the jobs that women could have were mourners. They were hired as criers. Even to this day in the Jewish community, you can hire criers when someone dies, because you can't be at the cemetery when you're sitting Shiva at home for 7 days. So you hire criers. I remember where I lived in Montreal, not far from a Jewish cemetery. I couldn't figure out why they were crying so loud and so hard. It was so painful. I mean, I could tell it was painful. But later on, one of my rabbinic students at Hebrew Union College did her master's thesis on criers in Judaism as a job. So they were hired to cry. And then in Scripture, we actually read in that God keeps our tears in his bottle. So this was a tradition. Women in healthcare. I'm going to go pretty quick here. Just, healthcare was very connected to witchcraft almost, divination, because they didn't have, they had potions. But I thought this is so cute. If a woman of childbearing age is pregnant and the top of her forehead is greenish, her fetus is a male, and meaning it will be fully formed. If the top of the forehead of a woman of childbearing age is white and shines, her fetus is a female, and it will become rich and fat. It is, if it is dark, the fetus is female, which is the same word as being healthy. If it is reddish, her fetus is male and it will die. So this is actually a translation of a text that you have, one of many, many texts that talk about, childbirth and midwifery, which is a very common job in the ancient Near East for women. And and then women in the law. We have a lot of laws that talk about how women were treated in all kinds of situations of rape, incest, abortion. miscarriage, if someone hit you and you lost a child, what was the compensation, homosexuality, lesbianism, bestiality, prostitution, falsely accused. There's one law that was interpreted also, regarding abortion. A self-induced abortion was something that is mentioned in ancient Near Eastern texts also. So the methods, I think the one that I'm aware of was drinking a certain kind of potion or that type of thing in order to lose the child, that type of thing. So as you can see, women are mentioned throughout society, throughout text, throughout the ancient Near East. And this is just a little overview of a course I teach in 13 weeks. And so this is where we are. Thank you.